Okay, welcome everybody to our session entitled Coping with Face-to-Face Speaking Assessments in a Global Crisis, Ways to Bridge the Gap. This session will be presented by Emily Chung, who is an English teacher in Niigata City in Japan. Her current focus is English for younger learners from 9 to 15 years old. On top of that, she is interested in online education, such as creating a virtual platform for learning and also developing modules to prepare learners for higher education. Despite the pandemic, she hopes to still be able to connect with like-minded people who believe in the power of education. So I think we can all agree that she's in the right place. Emily is also a foodie who aims to visit all the prefectures in Japan one day, which is quite ambitious, but certainly possible. Her favorite place to do research is at a cafe that has plenty of sunlight and serves good black coffee. And I can say that I've had a lot of black coffee over the past 2 days to get me through the festivities, shall we say. So with that, I turn it over to you, Emily, to begin your session. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just one more session to go and you'll be done for New Directions for today. So thank you very much for joining me on this last presentation today, everyone. My name is Emily. And before I proceed, I hope everyone is able to access the chat for a little bit. I'm hoping if you could answer yes or no to this question. So have you done any online learning or teaching since the pandemic began? So in the chat, could you please type yes or no? Okay, thank you very much, everyone. If you could see the chat, basically everyone has said yes. So which means that going online is a very obvious solution to education during this pandemic. However, that is not the case for my study today on coping with face-to-face speaking assessments in a global crisis. So in the context of Japan, when the pandemic hit, the schools were closed for 1 month and all the lessons were not held online at all. But when the school year started once again, the classes went back to face-to-face. However, in April 2020, that's when the school year starts, the government decided to make English compulsory for grades 5 and 6 in Japan. Grades 5 and 6 students are from 10 to 12 years old. So while this is happening, the new COVID-19 guidelines were also introduced. And you might know some of these already, for example, wearing masks. So students and teachers were required to wear a mask in schools at all times. The next thing is also to avoid the 3 C's. The 3 C's are, first one is close contact, which means that the teachers and the students were not allowed to maintain a very close distance with each other, especially when talking. Closed spaces, which means the classrooms had to be ventilated at all times, and also crowded spaces where they are not allowed to attend very large gatherings or meetings. And all these guidelines pose some challenges to Japanese teachers who are forced to observe them while they are conducting speaking assessments in their schools for the first time officially. This is a gap between how the testing used to be done previously compared to right now when they had to do it in the pandemic. So the study is looking at one problem statement where during the pandemic, the teachers were actually asked to do individual testing, but not so much of how to do it. So they were asked to just maintain a one-to-one conversation with their students, but how can they actually conduct this? Could the government have waited perhaps another year or two before they made English compulsory for elementary school? However, they decided to proceed with the plan because they've already decided before the pandemic that English would be a compulsory subject for elementaries grade 5 and 6 in Japan. Before I proceed, I would like to give you a bit of a background of the situation before the pandemic and what's happening during the pandemic. So before this, speaking tests were actually optional. Teachers were not obliged to do these tests at all, but they were encouraged to. So actually, all the teachers that I've included in this study decided to proceed with these speaking tests, but the students were not evaluated or graded officially for them. The reason they did this is because they wanted to expose students to the idea of speaking assessments as they would face more of these as they grow older. Instead of that, they would focus on listening and writing. So why listening? If you're familiar with the context of Japan, as students go out of the classroom, they're not able to listen to English conversations daily, like most of us might have been doing. And also for writing, because the teachers want to equip the students at least with their ABCs and knowing how to write before they move on to junior high school. Before COVID-19, the speaking tests that were conducted were all done with a lot of collaboration with their peers, a lot of group work, so the students had plenty of interaction between the teacher and their friends in the class. However, when the pandemic came up, things changed a little bit, where speaking skills are now assessed. So teachers are now held accountable for grading their students, and they are required to conduct these tests regularly. What do I mean by regularly? So if students were to go through, say, 3 units, for example, the teachers could pick one of the units to conduct the speaking test on. Maybe it's on a topic of food or a topic on travel. So it's up to the teacher. And because of the pandemic, they are also forced to observe these guidelines that I've mentioned earlier while you're doing these speaking assessments. I would like to highlight some literature that I've included in this study. And this first one is very interesting, and some of you might have come across it, which is supporting the continuation of teaching and learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a very useful resource for so many kinds of online platforms that are available to help people cope with online learning during this pandemic. There are so many resources in a few languages, and they're also mostly free. So most institutions and students are able to access these resources at the moment if they have access to internet. However, in the case of my study, these teachers and students do not have the same opportunity to access those. For example, if students are not able to have internet at home, or if they don't have the device to access those resources, it becomes a challenge for them, especially when they are graded on speaking tests this term. The second study that I found was very interesting because mask actually impacts the way we speak with each other. So this study by Prabhurak actually says, although masks cause some speech quality degradation, the problem is usually with the fabric, where it is distracting for people when they speak, and also interpreting other conversations that come through. So this is something that is a challenge when it comes to pandemic, because of the guidelines where the teachers and the students have to wear the mask all the time. Some of the teachers have adopted the solutions provided by this literature review already. For example, focusing on more paralinguistic features of the language, for example, intonation and tone. We, instead of saying, let's turn to page 394, we would say, let's turn to page 394. The little enthusiastic tone really helps in the way you deliver what you want to say. On top of that, the teachers are also doing more nonverbal communication in the classroom, where students focus on gestures and also their body language when they speak. But let's see how that applies in speaking tests furthermore in this presentation. The study looks at 3 objectives, and for the first one, we looked at what happened before the pandemic. So we identified the methodologies used for preparing the students for these speaking tests. And after that, we looked at what happened during the pandemic, where the teachers modified and developed their new methodologies to fit the COVID-19 guidelines. And having that being said, we also look at how the effectiveness of these adapted methodologies are in testing fluency and accuracy in these speaking tests. Now let's look at this study's methodology, just to give you an idea of how this was conducted. So a qualitative one-to-one interview was done with 4 Japanese teachers, and also the observing of these speaking tests. So in my experience, I have seen how these tests were conducted during the pandemic. And the sample size would be the teachers here who have conducted speaking tests for over 400 students already. And also a classroom has an average of 35 students. Here are some of the main questions that were posed to the teachers during the interview. So the questions covered, how did the teachers do the speaking test before the pandemic when the COVID-19 guidelines were still not in place? Also, we asked them, how did they adapt their methodologies to do the speaking test during the pandemic with the COVID-19 guidelines, preparing the students for the test, and also how effective were those methods of conducting the test accurate in testing fluency and accuracy. And finally, to address a big question, which is how can teachers determine what students are saying when they're wearing masks during the speaking test? From all the information that's gathered from the teachers, I have put this into a funnel. So this is actually a framework that is very popularly used in the business world called tofu, mofu, bofu. And I'll explain to you for a short while. So the top part of the funnel is where you create awareness. For example, when you're creating awareness for a customer who wants to buy a product. And in the learning wheel, it's the same thing, where you have to set the scene for the student so they have some context to grasp the language before they even proceed to the speaking test. So this is the way that you start introducing a topic to a student before they proceed. In the middle part, you can see that we talk about curiosity and how the customer interacts with the product. But in the learning world, this is where students can engage with the context that was introduced to them from the top and how they hope to learn from it in preparation for the speaking assessments. And finally, at the bottom, this is the part where conversion of sales is done for a customer. And then the same thing for speaking assessments, this is where the teachers can see how the students actually did the speaking test based on what they've learned and what they've discovered in the classroom. So to address the problems in the study, there are three main ones that the teachers have pointed out. The first one includes physical contact, which is a part of the COVID-19 guidelines to avoid, if you remember the first C. So this is an issue when it comes to cultural awareness because English is such a lingua franca and everyone around the world is using English in a different way. So the students in schools learn English by being exposed to the different cultures, not only native speaking like English. So for example, if in the context of Japan, students and teachers say hello by bowing. They don't touch, they don't hug, they don't shake hands like most of us do. So to demonstrate a bit of cultural awareness, the teacher would introduce shaking hands before the speaking assessment. But now in terms of COVID-19, students are not able to do that with their teachers. So the cultural awareness is getting a little limited here. There are ways around this which were proposed by the teachers. The first one is the use of YouTube, which is a very popular solution for these kind of issues during the pandemic at the moment. So if the students are able to demonstrate how much of different cultures that they understand, this is very useful for them in the speaking assessments because they can actually show those videos to the teacher and say, this is what I've found, this is what I've learned and discovered. The second one is using Google Earth, where if there's a topic on travel, students can demonstrate how they understand the location of a place. For example, if a student wants to visit the UK, they could point out, here's the Big Ben on Google Earth. I would like to go there for a holiday. And this is a way for assessing understanding in a speaking test. Finally, using mind maps in a speaking assessment, I feel that this is a very underrated method to use in a test because this is actually very valuable and helpful for students at such a young age when they're approaching tests for the first time. So they could pull up a mind map that they have created, finding all the resources on a tablet perhaps, and they were also able to present the mind map during the speaking assessment to show that, okay, this is the information that I've gathered for my topic that I would like to talk about. The second problem that I'd like to address is speaking anxiety. And because the tests are all now individually done, it is very difficult for students who had previously done a lot of pair and group activities with their friends to prepare themselves for these speaking assessments. Because of the lack of group interaction, it causes a lot of stress for the student when they go into a room for a speaking test with the teacher alone. This is a problem for a lot of kids here. So there are some solutions around this, and it involves gamification. The first one is the idea of role play. So instead of just doing a one-to-one kind of traditional speaking assessment, the teacher could call two students perhaps in a different classroom where they place one student at one end and the other student on one end. So if the first student can demonstrate a gesture, for example, I'm happy, the other student on the other side, student B, could say, oh, you are happy. And the teacher can be on the side assessing how the students understand each other. So as they do this, it also increases the amount of non-verbal communication understanding during speaking assessments. The second one is just allowing students to be the little investigative journalists that they can already be. Typically in an interview or a speaking test, you would have the teacher speaking to the students and only having it done one way, which is very traditional in a Japanese classroom. Instead of that, the teachers have allowed the students a short amount of time to ask questions back to the teacher to show what they have learned from the previous lessons. An example that can be given is if the student likes anime, they could ask the teacher about anime using the target language that they've already learned before. So the student could ask the teacher, do you like Demon Slayer, which is actually Kimetsu no Yaiba? It's a very popular movie at the moment. So this promotes a little interaction between the student and the teacher and allows the student opportunities to ask the teachers questions during a speaking assessment. Finally, we look at the issue of masks, where it hinders the way we see pronunciation and also facial expressions during a speaking assessment. In terms of pronunciation, I would like to give you a bit of a background here if you're not familiar with the Japanese language. So in Japan, it's very difficult for some speakers to distinguish between certain sounds. For example, in English, slow and throw. And in Japanese, because there is no TH sound, it is really difficult for them to distinguish between the two words. So slow can sound the same as throw, as in throw. So it's not easy to distinguish that, especially with a mask on in the speaking assessment. Something else that actually happened, and this is a true story, during the interview when one of the teachers told me that he wanted to say the word election during his talk with somebody, but an American speaker heard the word erection by accident, and this caused a huge problem between understanding what the speaker intended to say during the conversations. So something as simple as distinguishing the L and the R sound in Japanese is actually, to be honest, quite challenging. So with the mask being on, it makes it even more difficult for them to distinguish the sounds. Yep, don't want to get into that situation. So there's a solution around this, which is actually using music. So one of the actually the teachers in the classroom allowed the students to sing during the speaking assessments. So they would be graded as okay if they sang a part of the target language. Because they did that, it shows that they understood which part of the target language were they supposed to say or sing during the speaking assessment. The second one, some of you might be familiar with this, which is Carolyn Graham's jazz chants. So the teachers would start the class with a jazz chant, a song about the weather, and the students can actually repeat them during the speaking assessments to show that they are understanding what the teacher said. Finally, we're talking about mindful assessments, not just for the problem of mask, but also with speaking anxiety. So if students, after these speaking assessments, have to draw their face on how they felt after the assessment. So instead of relying on just a facial expression or verbal communication, the students can draw a picture of how they felt after the test, and the teacher can pay attention to that. If the students don't feel good, it will be a sign for a teacher to perhaps help them for the following speaking test that the students were going to do. We're going to look at some responses really quickly. The first one is, when the pandemic hit, I felt it was only natural to use videos through Zoom or Skype to practice speaking. So teachers allowed students to take out their masks when they're on Zoom with another student in another place, and they can practice the way they pronounce certain words. That was from one teacher. And another one said students record their practice sessions on the iPad and send them to the teachers. This solves the problem of not being able to see the pronunciation of certain words, and this helped them a lot during the speaking assessments. The next one, as I've mentioned, I use music from other resources than the textbook to help students remember the target language and to set the context. So using music in a speaking assessment is actually proven really helpful. Finally, there's a teacher who said, I want students to learn how to look for information that they want to share for the speaking test. So this creates a little curiosity in the students when they are sourcing for information for the speaking test to create more meaning. Now, moving forward, we're going to look at two parts. And the first one is using AI speech recognition technology. If some of you remember Trevor's session yesterday on AI and pronunciation between a human and a machine, I think that's a really important way of moving forward. And this is something I'm looking at this study as well. So personalized learning is extremely important, where the teacher can use the AI to see what ways they can use to let their students be prepared for English speaking tests before that. So English is learned differently around the world. And this is where the teachers can actually use AI to introduce ways that people speak English differently. The second one is how people love telling their stories, listening to stories, reading to stories nowadays. And as a way for students to practice their speaking, they can use AI to share their stories with different people from around the world. And this creates a lot of meaning in the way they would do their assessments after that. And finally, because of AI, it promotes a lot of self-directed learning where students can be more responsible for what they learn. So with AI, the teacher does not have to wait for a student to perhaps send a video over. Instead, the student can already use AI to find out, I have pronounced this word. How do I pronounce this word? And they don't have to wait for the teacher to get back to them before they can proceed. So learning would take place a lot faster. And next, we looked at the expansion of online assessment materials, where the filming on the iPad can actually help the students with their anxiety. So because the speaking tests are all done individually right now, it is really difficult for students who are not comfortable speaking with just one person in the room. So at this point, filming on the iPad allows students to be able to connect with a device instead of just going into the room and speaking with the teacher only. And the next one, when we look at online assessment materials, it also promotes a lot of learning where it's easier for the teacher to facilitate the assessments that the students are doing after that. Finally, I'm going to show you a video on how AI can actually be really useful in terms of speaking assessments. Please wait a moment.
Hey everyone! English is an interesting language for some people. Sometimes, when you look at a word, it doesn't sound the way it's spelled. Let's look at this sentence. K-I-T-E. Kite, kite, kaite, kaite.
Alexa, pronounce K-I-T-E.
I pronounce that kite, but I'm always working on how I say things and I might not have it right.
Alexa, thank you.
Anytime.
Now you can find out how to pronounce some words without waiting for somebody to get back to you. That's all for today. Thank you and have a nice day. Goodbye.
Okay, that's it for a demonstration. And so I hope that everyone has enjoyed this presentation, and I'm ready to take your questions right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emily. That was a fascinating presentation, and we do have a couple of questions. We have time for, I would say, two questions. First one I can see is from from Catherine Hughes. So Catherine is wondering, did teachers consider using clear visors as an alternative to face masks during speaking assessment, or was that not possible or permitted due to local Japanese laws?
Actually, the teachers could use the shields in the classroom. However, that's not provided for every single student. Instead, they are still asked to use masks in schools because those were more accessible for students.
Right, I
Yes,
see.
thank
Yeah,
you
that
for your
makes sense.
question.
And there's
Yeah.
another question from Jonathan Dixon. When the speaking assessment of students requires technology, is it important that all test takers have similar resources at hand? How was this ensured?
Of course. In the context of Japanese schools, one thing that I really do admire about the government over here is they try to make everyone, give everyone equal opportunity to all these pieces of technology. So for example, in schools, if they were using tablets or computers, the schools would make sure that every single student had access to the piece of technology that they were using, which is exactly why when it came to the time when the schools were closed, the online lessons were not taking place because not every single student had the same resource at home. So the school tries to accommodate that by providing those resources when the students are in the school grounds. Yeah,
You
thank you for your
mentioned as
question.
well, yeah, you mentioned as well that there were difficulties differentiating, I think, TH sounds.
Yes.
Obviously in Japan, I think a lot of people are familiar with the L and R problem.
Mhm.
You know,
Yes.
to differentiate between the two. Did you ever notice that as being a problem as well?
The teachers are actually aware of this problem because students tend to go back to their L1 interference where they would think about the words in terms of how they say it in their language. So in Japanese, they rely a lot on furigana. So the TH sound becomes an S sound, which is something that the teachers are trying to correct in the classroom as well. So they try to introduce students to different ways that you can pronounce it, which is why it is very important to show your face in the classroom when you are giving any pronunciation practice, because if not, the students are not able to distinguish or hear the sounds that they're supposed to know in English that don't exist in their L1. Yes.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's throwing up a lot of kind of problems that we maybe wouldn't have expected before. But we have time for one
Yes.
more question as well,
Sure.
from Catherine Ong. Catherine
Mhm.
says, concerning using AI technology, there is a challenge for students who attempt self-learning using a virtual assistant, as accents need to be quite clear for them to access learning. Is there a solution for this? Catherine wondered.
Thank you for the question. I think this is something that Trevor was also addressing in his presentation yesterday because of how different people would also interpret language differently in the context of Japan because of how the L1 is a huge interference with the way that they listen to and pronounce certain words in English. I feel like it's really important to collect enough data and samples to counter this problem because English is so different at different parts of the world. So it needs to be very certain for specific areas that are countering certain problems. So I do think it is very important to understand your market, the people that you are targeting, and your learners.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think we can leave it there now. That was a really great session. I'm glad we had a lot of questions, a lot of engagement from the audience. So thank you again, Emily. And I'll just stop the recording now. So for everybody else, the next session